Hey everybody, it's David Church. So I wanted to talk about the flowchart aspect of our class. As you know, in the week 2 individual assignments, you're asked to do a flowchart, and also your teams are asked to do it in week 4 in your team papers and your team presentations. So the flowchart aspect is a very powerful tool, right? Process flowcharts. It helps us look at the transformation processes within an organization, get better clarity on them and transparency, and then look to see if we can find any areas that we think maybe could be improved or potentially are not adding value as much as they can be. Look for areas of efficiency, and sometimes you might find that some steps in the process are really not needed anymore, or maybe were never needed. It's a very powerful tool. It's a great resume builder too, like to say that you understand how to do process flow charts and kind of look inside processes. So that's one of the great aspects of our class is that we try to connect real life topics that you would benefit from in your organization, irrespective of the path that you're going down. So right now on the screen, you should be able to see the template from ASQ's flowchart template. I've played a little bit with the flowchart to help facilitate this example. But before we go to my sample flowchart, I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what the different symbols mean. So the ASQ template has a nice legend over here that tells us what each of the symbols mean, but let's just talk through it very briefly. So the first one, which is kind of an oval, usually implies a start or end state, right? So you're entering the process flow or you're exiting it. And there can be multiple ways to enter some processes. There can be multiple ways to exit it. As you can see, just very briefly in ours, there's one entrance, receive an order. So an order comes into our process flow. And then we happen to have two different ways you can exit it. And we'll go through that together. Then the square or rectangle usually implies steps within your flow, right? As you're going through a flow, there's a series of steps. There's activities between the consumer and an employee, between employees, sometimes between consumers, employees, and systems, right? We want to understand all those steps, get clarity and transparency in all those steps. Then the connector aspect obviously connects everything, as you can kind of tell from the name, but the important aspect of the connector aspect as well is that it has an arrow that implies the flow, right? So that helps you understand the typical flow that you expect to see in this particular process or processes that you're looking at. Some process flows, you could see potentially multiple connectors, right? It's possible that one step might go into a few directions, or it's possible sometimes you can have bidirectional connection and communication, right? Traffic. Also, as we go to the next item in our symbols, the decision diamond, you can see usually the decision diamond has usually at least two connectors that come out of it, potentially more. Because the decision diamond is some evaluation that's occurring in your process flow. And in our example, you can see the first example is we run a credit check. Did the customer pass? Yes, go this direction. No, then go this direction. Right? So there's at least two. You could have cases where you could have multiple items that are more than two coming out of it. Now, coming out of your decision diamond. The key thing is you want your process flow to accurately represent the process you're trying to describe. Also, to whatever extent possible, you're trying to make it easy to read, right? Because you're creating this process flow in hopes that you can get better clarity on what's going on within the processes of your organization, as well as communicate that to other people, because ultimately you're evaluating, right, the efficiency and the effectiveness of everything that's going on in the process flow. There's the circle is kind of as a flowchart link. So oftentimes some of these process flows can get relatively big. Right now we have a very simple kind of high level example on the screen, and even then it looked like the process flow might kind of break out a little bit. So I just did a flowchart link to kind of show you an example of like, a side almost flow that might occur because we refused an order. And I'll go through that example in a second once we go through all the symbols. So the flowchart link is usually just your way to try to, in order to, again, make everything a little bit easy to understand and not too convoluted and complicated, you're essentially saying, okay, this particular aspect stops here and I'm going to continue it somewhere else. like as a side flow or whatnot. So oftentimes it could be exception flows and such that occur. Like, there's an example in our class of an Uber Eat order. So you could see a whole kind of exception flow that maybe occurs for a little bit about, like, if your order is wrong, you could see using a flowchart link just to kind of put some side steps that might need to occur. It's a nice way for you to be able to try to make things clear. And you can do like the example here shows refuse order, so that way it shows kind of a bookmark, like, that particular part of the flow ended there and then begins again on the side. Or sometimes you could even just put A, B, C, D, as long as you're just consistent, right? Because the reader needs to be able to understand that that's the placeholder, that's the link that now connects up in the other flow. So just those two circles should match. Then there's this like parallelogram, right? This input output. So when you believe it's helpful and you don't have to overuse it, but when it makes sense to you, this is a good place to kind of call out what inputs or outputs are necessary for particular steps. So in the example going again of that credit check, a consumer's credit history is obviously a valuable input. You could also see an example of maybe our organization requires your credit history and we also require a copy of your driver's license. So those could be two inputs that we call out. This is particularly key if you're trying to understand maybe if there's areas to improve in your processes, right? Maybe you end up starting to suspect that some of the inefficiencies you're seeing is because you're not asking for the proper amount of inputs up front and you're waiting until activities occur before you go back and you ask for inputs, or maybe you're asking for too many up front. So it does. So the degree that you call out the inputs and outputs is ultimately going to depend on the uniqueness of your organization of what you're trying to assess. But again, it can be a helpful tool when it makes sense. And then this kind of half of a square rectangle that's been like ripped in part is it attempting to try to show like a document, right? So in the example of a credit check, you can see the output of that would be a credit report, or you could see an invoice, an order receipt. Again, in many of the flows that you could potentially be using for your week 2 assignment, your week 4 team assignments, or in real life, you could arguably have countless inputs, outputs, and documents. So you need to try to use a little bit of your own decision-making and assessment on to what extent do you want to call those out. Does it make sense? Is it adding any value? Is it helping, right? Like, especially if you think that there's activities around it that could potentially, add value. And you can always revise, right? So, maybe your first few drafts, you end up leaning towards putting more inputs and outputs and documents than you might end up needing at the end, right? And you can simplify. And the nice thing about process flows, you could also have one version that's perhaps more executive friendly, like, a little bit higher level. Some of the details are not there. And then you have other versions of that same process flow that are far more detailed. So you can play with these dynamics, right? Because it's all about communication within, your organization. So you and others that you're attempting to influence and lead can have a very healthy discussion about where there's areas for improvement. Okay, so those are the symbols that are in the ASQ template. So in this example is a little bit different. It's similar to the one that you should see in your ASQ template that you see online. I just played with the example a little bit more because their example wasn't really finished. So if I'm going to create a video, I thought I should at least be able to kind of show you a finished product. So in this example, we're receiving an order. So our associate enters the order in the system, or it could be a customer who's entering the order in the system, through self-service activities like a website or a kiosk. Then we're running a credit check. So as I mentioned, you could imagine an input coming in here, like, okay, we're running a credit check, so we need the credit history. We could also ask for driver's license. We could also ask for other items. And then this decision diamond is evaluating, did that person pass the credit check? So here we just said, okay, yes, no. You can also put a real question there if you want, right? It's up to you. There's a little bit of kind of art, so to speak, in the process flow. So you could just put here pass credit check, and then you could have a yes, no that branches out of it, whatever you believe makes it easier to read. So in this case, yes, no, let's go for no for a second. So no, this individual did not pass. So this credit check, and then now you can see the next step is manual underwrite. So it implies that we just did an automated underwrite. So perhaps again, this could all be through the self-service system, or we're using our technology system as employees. And then we decide, okay, we're going to manually underwrite. It's going to take a little bit longer. We're going to have to ask for things like tax returns. So we need another new input now, right? Because we're manually underwriting. Maybe we're dealing with a customer who doesn't have like salaried income. It's somebody whose, income is all based on like their investments or inheritance or whatnot. So and they might not have a huge credit history that's been established. So now we're essentially, by asking for tax returns, and we could ask for maybe asset statements, we're attempting to manually assess their credit worthiness and whether or not we can move forward. So we ask for a tax return, we do a manual credit check. Okay, now are we okay? Yes, no. Let's again keep on the no track. No. So we're going to refuse the order. So I could technically I could have made this a stop here, and I could have just put, that oval start in and say refuse the order, we're done. But I thought, in real life, an organization may not want to necessarily send a customer away and say you're out. So I did do a flowchart link up above, and I gave just 2 more process steps that said, okay, discuss referral options. Maybe there's other companies that we could refer them to that have, more liberal standards in terms of, credit worthiness, and potentially, we would get like a referral fee for doing that. Or even discuss the fact that, hey, you could come back with a co-signer, and if you do that, come back, and then we'll start this whole process over again. So I mentioned those 2 steps here: discuss referral options, future co-signer options, and then the order is complete. So at least that way, hopefully, we're not just throwing customers out saying like, we have no ability to help you, you're out. So hopefully there's a little bit of friendly discussion there. So that is a terminal status. Now that particular one, from that option, that's done. We've exited the flow at that point. Thank you. And then if that individual comes back again, we would be restarting the flow at receive order. So now let's go back to the yeses, right? So now credit check, yes. So the automated credit check passed. The credit report is our document that we generated from that. We can keep that for our records. We give the customer a copy if our policies allow that. And then we check the inventory. And then before I move from there, I just want to go back to the other option, is if we did say no on the credit check, but we manually ran the credit check, and this time we said, okay, based on our internal guidelines, even though you didn't pass our automated credit check, our manual one seems to think that you're okay. So then again, we go back. So you notice this is allowing us to go back into the flow again. Okay, yes, now we can go back to checking inventory. So we check the inventory. Do we have whatever product that the customer is looking for? If the answer is no, then we need to order that material so we can assemble the order and move on to the flow. Or the answer is yes, we assemble the order. So you can see again another decision diamond, which ultimately you're going to get to the same place of assemble the order, but there's an extra step that needs to occur if we don't have the inventory. Then we need to order the material and the parts. And I didn't call this out here. Probably that should have been a step to call out, like, communicate to the customer to let them know it's going to take longer to get your order then, right? Because we have to order those parts. So probably instead of giving it to you in 48 hours, it might take us a week. Those are, real life aspects, of course, by having additional steps in the flow. We assemble the order, and then we complete the order. So another terminal status. In this case, in the completion of the order generates an order receipt. Here you go. Thank you for your business. Here's your receipt. Keep this if you have any problems. You have 30 days to return the product and all that good stuff. So this is a simplified flow that hopefully gives you a bit of an understanding of how to kind of do process flow charts. You are ultimately being allowed in week 2 to pick some activity that you're familiar with as a consumer. You may not know all of the different steps that occur behind the scenes as an employee. So, try to pick something that you feel like comfortable that you do know. The assignment does say, like, after you've completed the flow, it might actually help you kind of think of questions that you wish you knew. Like, I wish I knew, like, what happens if, in this example, like, let's say if we were doing this, like, what happens if my credit check doesn't pass? Like, I don't completely know all those steps because I've never been down that path. So that's totally fair. And in that assignment, you can note some of those questions, right? Here's a flow I created. And after creating the flow, it made me realize I wish I'd had answers to some of these questions. And the fact that you're even thinking about some of those questions, like wishing you had access to some of this information, is the exact activity, is the exact kind of line of thinking that this activity is attempting to generate. In your week 14 papers, you're being asked to kind of hopefully pick something you have a little bit more knowledge of, either some organization that you or your team is familiar with, or picking something that has public information that you'll be able to obtain that. And then again, you're being asked to do a process flow. So in our class, it's a process improvement management class. You can imagine process flow is a very big aspect of it. So do try to feel comfortable with it. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do think it's a really good knowledge to have, coming out of our class. Even if you decide, operations is not necessarily where, you see your future career being, whatever functional career you end up going, marketing, strategy, sales, advertising, technology, process flowcharts, you're going to see these over and over again. And you might not be the one creating them, but it's very helpful if you understand them, right? So it's a great skill to come to take away with, I should say, from our class. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. So I will, you have access to this video. You're more than welcome, as always, to ask me any questions you might have. You can use email. You can also use the virtual office. And there is a sample that's also in the Blackboard, which is around Uber Eats. So you can use what you've just learned from this video. Now look at that sample and walk through, and you can see this actually from a previous class. You can see how the student with some modifications kind of saw the process flow working for an Uber Eats transaction. All right, thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.